My name is Michael DeWild. I'm the director of the Business Ethics Center here. Welcome to the 4th annual Barry Castro Business Ethics Lecture. Tonight featuring Dr. Mary Gentilly, who has come to us from Babson College. She's also been a professor at the Harvard Business School. She's been an independent consultant for many years, has worked with the Aspen Institute, which is a premier think tank, business think tank, headquartered in Washington, D.C. Her primary interest, what she's going to be speaking to us on tonight, is something called, that she is the innovator of and lead practitioner on, though it's grown to be a program that's now in place at over 100 universities on several continents, called Giving Voice to Values, Moral Competency and Courage. I just want to do a brief thank you to the Dean's Office, Dean Williams of the Seidman Business School, Vani Herrera, Dana Lewis, Patty Schneider, and a host of others who helped make this evening possible. We hope you enjoy the talk. Dr. Gentilly is going to speak for about 50 minutes or so, and then there'll be a Q&A session after that. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mary Gentilly.
Good evening. Can you all hear me? Yeah? Okay, good. I'm really delighted to be here. I want to thank Michael, first of all. I want to thank the dean, actually several deans who I met at dinner tonight, and the president. I've just had a really wonderful experience here. Short, but very good. I'm really happy and feel privileged to have the opportunity to share with you the Giving Voice to Values curriculum tonight. As Michael told you, this is a new curriculum that we've been developing over the last 4 years or so. It has been the venture funders for this curriculum were Yale School of Management and the Aspen Institute. And currently it is housed and funded by Babson College in Boston. So what I'd like to do tonight is to tell you some stories. I'm going to tell you some stories about what led us to conceive of and develop Giving Voice to Values as not just a curriculum, but really an approach, a way of thinking about acting on our values in the workplace. I also, you may have noticed, or you may not have noticed, that when Michael asked me to give a title to my talk tonight, I was thinking, what can I call it? And I had been recently invited to write a chapter for a book on moral courage. But they wanted me to write a chapter about giving voice to values, about this curriculum and this approach. And I realized that in the course of writing this chapter for a book on moral courage, that the point I ended up making is that really voicing and acting on your values is less about moral courage than it is about moral competence. And if you become very competent at this process, courage is less a necessity. Not that it's never a necessity, but it becomes less of a necessity. So I'll revisit that later, but I just wanted to set that up to tell you where that thinking came from. But let me begin just by telling you some stories. And the first story I'm going to tell you is about my experience back in the mid-'80s when I first the first business school I ever joined and ever worked with was Harvard Business School. And I joined them in 1985. And I had come out of a doctorate in literature and film, and I felt that I had, fallen down the rabbit hole. It was an entirely different kind of context and environment for me. And I remember going to the orientation for all the incoming first-year MBA students. And at that time, it's more now, but at that time it was about 900 students. And they would bring them into a huge auditorium. And the dean would come up and stand in front of the group. And this is something that's not unique to Harvard. It's something that happens at other schools as well. But my first exposure was there. And they would bring the students together, and the dean would say, look to the left of you, look to the right of you. These people are going to be your career network for the rest of your lives. Now, there were some implicit and explicit messages in that phrase. He wanted people, first of all, to notice and to feel that they were a pretty select group. They were supposed to feel pretty special about themselves and pretty impressed with each other. Another message was that you know, this really is a rich resource for you. This is one of the benefits you're getting from coming to business school, is meeting other talented people whom you can learn from and network with and connect with over the course of your career. And then also, you probably don't want to irritate too many people because you're going to want to be able to maintain your relationships with them in an instrumental way. They're going to be useful to you. So that was an interesting message to me. Certainly nothing you ever heard when you were doing a doctorate in literature. But I thought, OK. So a few years later, when I was invited to be part of the group of faculty who were designing the first required ethics and decision-making curriculum for the Harvard MBA, we decided, let's take this opportunity to adjust and morph that message a little bit. What do we really want to say to students as they begin this 2-year program about their network and about ethics? And so what we said to these students was, look to the left of you, look to the right of you. For the rest of your career, this will be a network of people with whom you've actually talked out loud about how to think about deciding what the right thing to do is when you're in the workplace and when you encounter ethical dilemmas. So that seemed like a good development. It was, you know, let's actually use this network in a values-driven way. But it didn't seem exactly that inspirational. And we weren't really sure that it was doing everything we wanted to do. But then a few years later, after I'd left Harvard, in the late 90s and the early, around 2000, I had a consulting project where I was brought into Columbia Business School. And Columbia Business School was at the time trying to integrate values and attention to wider society and the environment and ethics into their curriculum. And they had asked their incoming MBA class, which was a class of 600, to do an interesting exercise. It was not my idea. It was something they were doing. But because I was there, I had the opportunity to witness it. And they asked all the incoming MBA students to write a little essay, just, you know, a few paragraphs, less than a page, and to answer this question. Think about a time when your values conflicted with what you were asked or expected to do in the workplace, and describe how you handled it. So I was working with Columbia over a number of years. I had the opportunity to read hundreds of these essays, well over 1,000 of them, and it was really interesting. First of all, you have to imagine who the MBA students are at Columbia. They tend to be people who've been out in the workplace for a number of years, 4, 5, 6 years, so they've had some experience. So that was the first lesson. We can count on one hand the number of students who did not have a story to tell about a time when their values conflicted with what they were asked to, or expected to do. So right away, we've established this is reality, this is not some sort of fantasy. Then secondly, because of the kinds of students who are attracted there, they tended to come, at the time anyways, they represented certain industries to a larger extent. So there were a lot of people from financial sector, there were a lot of people from general management consulting, the big consulting firms. There were a good number of people from pharma, from pharmaceutical firms, a number of people from high tech, a little from advertising. So given that they came disproportionately from a certain number of industries, the kinds of dilemmas and scenarios they described started to get pretty repetitious after a while. They were describing things like, I was asked or pressured to inflate or deflate billable hours in my reporting. Or I was asked to distort the equations I used in order to evaluate the relative attractiveness or lack of attractiveness of certain financial transactions, depending on what my company wanted to promote. Or I was asked to puff up the capacities of a new high-tech product or a new pharmaceutical product, perhaps a little bit beyond its actual capacity at this point in time, but to make it sound a little better than it was. So these kinds of scenarios got kind of repetitious. But what was really interesting to me is that the responses differed. And we looked at the responses, and they tended to fall in a few groups. And the first group, the largest group, a little less than half of them, said, you know, I encountered this kind of values conflict, and it really bothered me, but I really didn't feel that I had any options. There was nothing I could really do about it, given my position in the organization. So I just sucked it up, and I did what they told me to do. And then there was a small group who said, yes, I encountered this kind of conflict, and it bothered me a lot. I wasn't really sure what to do about it. I didn't feel like I had any options, but I couldn't live with it. So I removed myself from the situation. They either quit the job, or they got themselves transferred to a different work group or a different boss within the organization, but they just pulled themselves out of the dilemma altogether. And then the rest of the group, about a third of the group, said, yes, I encountered this kind of conflict. It bothered me enough that I felt I had to do or say something, and I tried. And a small group of that set of folks said, I tried and I failed. But about a quarter of the entire group said, I tried to act on my values, and by my lights, I was successful. So I thought, isn't this interesting? The same scenarios, or the same kinds of scenarios are being described in all of these groups. But some of them feel that there are actually options available to them, and some of them feel that there are no options available to them. Now, recognize that this is an exercise in self-reporting, so it's not scientific, but it's very provocative. And recognize that the way the exercise was structured, we didn't ask them to describe something that you think is an ethical dilemma or that I think is an ethical dilemma, but that they don't. We actually asked them to describe situations that they experienced as a true values conflict. It violated their values and how they handled it. So we thought, what can we learn from this? So we started looking at the people who had been able to voice their values and the people who had not, and we tried to see what's different about these groups. Is one group just more savvy, more politically sophisticated, more talented and able to come up with scenarios and different ways of addressing the issues? Or is one group, does one group just seem more morally troubled by this than the other? And we just didn't find those kinds of differences. We found sort of the same degrees of sophistication and naivete in both groups. Everybody seemed to be troubled by the scenario they described because that was in fact the assignment, describe something where it was a conflict for you. What did seem in the end to be the only distinction that we could see was that the folks who had found a way to voice and act on their values effectively in the workplace, at some point in the process, had said something out loud outside of their own heads. They may have started out talking to a family member or a spouse or partner or to a friend, but eventually they talked to someone. It made its way into the organization. And once it did, it changed the trajectory of what happened next. Now, sometimes the strategies that these people engaged in were really clever, win-win scenarios where they were quite clever. And sometimes they were kind of clumsy. But in all of these cases, the only thing that seemed consistent was this idea of voice. And this reminded me of some research that I had seen a number of years earlier when I was at Harvard, where there were a number of a couple scholars, Douglas Hunneke and Perry London, who had done research on, getting back to the title of tonight's talk, moral courage and altruism. And they had looked at and interviewed people who had been rescuers during World War II. And these are people who had risked their lives to help other people who were at risk during the Holocaust. Sometimes they knew the people they were helping to rescue, sometimes they didn't. Presumably, there were a lot of other people who thought what was going on was not good, but these were people who were able to step up and do something, often at their own peril. And the folks who interviewed them tried to see, well, are there any common characteristics we can learn about these people? And they came up with a list of characteristics, but the one that always struck me, probably because I was an educator, was that the people who were able to act in this kind of courageous way and to take this kind of action reported that at an earlier point in their lives, as young adults, they had had the experience of rehearsing out loud with someone they respected. It could have been a boss or a teacher or a mentor or even a parent, but they had rehearsed out loud scenarios, what-if scenarios. What would you say if? And then they had laid out certain kinds of, or what would you do if? And then they laid out certain kinds of moral conflicts. And the idea was that these folks had actually rehearsed or pre-scripted what they would say, and they had made an intentional commitment to it by voicing it out loud to someone they respected who stood as proxy for the person they might have to speak to at another point in their life. So this was interesting to me, and it started to make me think about the way we think about business ethics, the way we teach about business ethics, both in educational institutions, which is where most of my experience had been till then, but also I have seen since then in a lot of business contexts where they try and do training around these kinds of issues, and certainly in our daily conversations with people about ethical conflicts. And what it seems that we tend to do are two things. We tend to focus on, first, awareness, the idea that we're going to make people aware of the kinds of ethical conflicts or moral dilemmas they might end up encountering in their workplace experience. This happens in the classroom, and it happens in corporate training settings. And the idea behind it is that you might not recognize the ethical conflict when it comes along. And there's some validity in this, in the sense that if you're new to an industry, you don't know the norms, you don't know the laws, you don't know the rules, the regulations, or if you're operating in a new context, or you're going overseas, or you're dealing with a new product that has a particular set of risks associated with it, you might not be aware of all the kinds of dilemmas that come up. But the other thing that I realized after either teaching or sitting in on thousands of hours of ethics classes and business school programs over the years is that the scenarios, the problems, the situations that end up on the front page of the paper, the ones that lead educators and critics and pundits to decry what's happening in business education, are the ones that most of us would have agreed were pretty obviously wrong. Sometimes they even violated the law. And so I started to think, well, maybe we can't, all recognize some of these other scenarios, but there's a lot of stuff that we actually are pretty aware of, and that's not the problem. So awareness building, it's a useful thing. It seemed inadequate. The second thing we tend to do is to focus on analysis. And what we do there is we teach students, or we ourselves practice learning about the different models of ethical reasoning. Deontology, utilitarianism, virtue-based ethics, etc. And we then use those models of ethical reasoning to help us work through ethical dilemmas. Now, this is also not a bad thing. It helps us to discipline our reasoning. It helps us to recognize when we might be seeing things narrowly through our own personal lens and we're missing the impact on someone else over here, or we're not understanding why this person thinks differently. So that's a good thing to do. But it doesn't necessarily prepare you to act on your values. I think the best way to illustrate that is a story. When I was developing the Giving Voice to Values curriculum, after we had this insight about voicing, we started going out and interviewing people. And we interviewed everyone from recent graduates to CEOs. And we sort of, we did a snowball technique where we'd say, tell me who I can talk to. Who do you know who has a good story to tell when they have, in fact, encountered a values conflict and they have thought about ways to address it. And so we did a lot of these interviews. And one of the guys I interviewed had been referred to me by a colleague. And he was an entrepreneur, a very successful entrepreneur, who owned his own company. And he said, Mary, I want to tell you a story. He said, whenever I hire an MBA graduate into my company, the last interview is with me. So once everyone else in the company has interviewed them, they've decided they want to make the offer, I get to interview them last and make the offer if I agree. And he said, recently, I was interviewing a young man who came from one of the top business schools. And he came into my office, and we were having a conversation. I was asking him about his education. And I asked him, did you take a business ethics class in your MBA program? And he said, oh, yes, we had a required business ethics class. Everyone had to take it. And so the CEO said, well, that's good. Tell me, what did you learn? And he said, well, I learned all the models of ethical reasoning, deontology, utilitarianism, etc. And then I learned that whenever you encounter an ethical conflict in the workplace, I can decide what I think I want to do. And then I can select the model of ethical reasoning that will give me the best arguments to support the position that I wanted to take. Now, the CEO said this to me with a wry smile, and clearly this was not the intent that the faculty member intended to have on his or her students. But there's a certain grain of truth to this. These models of ethical reasoning, and I'm not condemning them. As I said, I think they're useful for disciplining our reasoning, but they don't tell us what to do, and they don't even tell us what's right. They give us an idea of what we need to think about and what we need to consider. But in the end, they often conflict with each other. So, and then what happens in the classroom, which I have seen, many, many hours of this, are these endless debates about what's right and what's wrong. And what's interesting is that there are times when reasonable people of goodwill will disagree. But there's often scenarios where people come in kind of thinking they know what's right, and they basically spend the class generating a set of what one professor at Harvard called professional rationalizations. And this particular professor wasn't in the business school. He was in the School of Public Health. But I was interviewing him for a project that was looking at how do we teach ethics in the profession. So I was talking to business faculty, law faculty, faculty from medical school, public health. And he said, most professions teach you how to be proof against the professional rationalizations in your field. They teach you how to see through the kinds of dangerous rationalizations that may lead you to mistreat your client or your patient. But he said, but I fear sometimes that in business schools we teach the professional rationalizations. And I think that's actually what that businessman was talking about as well. So anyways, there's some limitations to awareness. There's some limitations to analysis. There's also some analysis. There's also some benefits. But what I felt was missing was action, the third A. What we didn't do is actually give students the opportunity to practice, to pre-script, and to rehearse, and to peer coach each other on developing effective, credible responses that you could make in the workplace if you are pressured or asked explicitly to do something that violates your values. And to have the chance to rehearse those with your peers, just as we talked about those rescuers did with parents or teachers or mentors, to rehearse them and to peer coach. And so that was really the beginning of the Giving Voice to Values curriculum and the idea behind it. We decided what we wanted to do was to ask a new question in business ethics. And instead of asking what is the right thing or whether I can do the right thing, the question is how can I do the right thing? And so we created an entirely different set of materials. I used to run the case writing program at Harvard Business School, and I'm sure most of you have been familiar with the Harvard Business School style of cases. They tend to be 20 pages long or so. They tend to end with a CEO who sits back in his or her chair and puts their arms behind their head, looks out the window and says, what should I do? And then the students will, for 90 minutes, discuss all the pros and cons and discuss this. Well, these cases are not like that at all. These cases are very short. Sometimes they're less than a page. Sometimes they're 2 or 3 pages long. But the most important thing about them is that they end with the protagonist in the case saying, I know what I think the right thing to do is. So how can I get it done? What do I need to say? To whom? In what sequence? And then what will they say back? And then what will I say? And what kinds of data do I need to gather in order to be persuasive? So these cases are designed as opportunities to develop action plans and scripts, to practice them with your peers, and to get positive feedback to make them stronger. Now, there's some reasons why we designed it this way, and I'm going to go through some of them because I think they're important in terms of what's distinctive about this approach, and I think also what helps me, and I hope will help you, I know is helping others, to feel more equipped to voice and act on our values. So one of the things is that we didn't want to design a curriculum that relied upon appealing to John Rawls or Aristotle or any of the other great philosophers. We wanted to create a curriculum that relied upon knowing your discipline and knowing your industry and knowing your business and knowing your field. The reason we wanted to do that is because we want faculty who are not necessarily ethicists to feel comfortable leading a discussion, and we want students who are going to become business people to feel that they have scripts they can credibly use in the workplace that will communicate effectively to their boss, their peer, their customer, whoever it is that they need to make their arguments to. So if the dilemma is something that crops up in an accounting situation, we want you to use the language and the tools of accounting to respond to it. If the challenge crops up in a marketing situation, we want you to use the language and the tools of marketing. So that's one of the premises there. The idea there is to make it both more user-friendly for faculty, but ultimately and most importantly, more effective and useful for students. The other thing is that we did not design this curriculum with the idea that it was going to be used in ethics classes. We designed this curriculum with the idea that it was going to be used across the curriculum, and that it may not even necessarily always be labeled ethics. But what it was going to be about was learning to be able to effectively and persuasively voice your values and act on them. So that's been at the heart of it, and it's been kind of interesting to see how this has developed. As Michael said to you, I wasn't really sure if this was going to catch on. We have now got, it's been growing very rapidly, kind of stunning to me. We say over 100 pilots. I wouldn't be surprised if it was getting close to 200 pilots, because what happens is people don't always tell us that they're using it, and I find out about it later. We have them pilots mostly at business schools, but increasingly we're getting requests from businesses as well to use this approach in their own internal training. And they're on 5 continents now. We weren't sure that this would work cross-globally. We've been getting some interesting feedback on that, which I'd be happy to tell you about. But before I go into that, what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit more about the approach itself. I've given you the heart of it. It's a thought experiment. It asks the question, what if I was going to act on my values? How would I handle it? It tries to avoid the debates that often happen in discussions of ethics, where when you present a difficult situation, instead of focusing on how to act on what you might think is right, you spend most of your time talking about why you can't. And I don't say that to be critical, because I think that comes from a really natural and human place. I think there's a part of us that when we hear some of these scenarios, instinctively we know, I could never say that. That would never be heard. I could not say no to my boss about this issue. In this business, how could I ever say something that's going to maybe turn down some short-term profit for some long-term gain? You know, I could never voice that. So at some level, without even saying it, we think that or we know that. And so we immediately go to a place that I call preemptive rationalizations. So because we already know at some level that we don't think we can do it, we immediately start creating reasons why it's not so bad anyways. It's really not wrong. And it's not that we're trying to be deceptive. It's not that we're trying to just rationalize our behavior. It's because it's almost an unconscious process that because we don't think it's possible, we immediately create sort of these reasons that make it easier for us to explain our lack of action. And so what we want to do is we want to preempt that whole process. And the way we do that is by not asking you whether it's possible or whether it's truly wrong or right. What we simply say is, you know, what if, this is your thought experiment, what if you thought this was the right thing to do, how would you get it done? And then we send you off with a set of questions and tools to try and create scenarios and responses. So you don't have to agree with me that the right thing to do is to say no to this boss who's pressuring you to cook the books. You just have to say, for the sake of this exercise, let me think about whether there's an effective way to resist him or her. And the reason for that is that it's our assumption that there probably are a number of students who would actually think that was the wrong thing to do, but aren't sure that in business you can say no. And so if you create a safe space where you can experiment with that, you might in fact change reality. But this is in fact a thought experiment, and by framing it that way, it makes it safer. It makes it safer for the students. It also makes it safer for the faculty. I think one of the biggest challenges for faculty in this area is that they're not sure. It's not that they don't think it's important to be responsible business people and to live ethically. It's that they're not sure that they have a response. It's not sure that they know how to help the students do that. And it's true that they're aware of all the pressures the students are going to encounter. And so what this does is it does not require the faculty member to have all the answers either. It simply says, let's ask a new question. So that's the heart of it, which I've explained. Let me tell you, in our interviews, we talked to people who had the experience of voicing and acting on their values and were willing to share the stories with us. And we turned a lot of them into cases. All of them are disguised. But we also identified what we call 7 pillars, 7 things that seem to stand out and seem to be important as orientations or frameworks or tools for doing this. And I want to just run through those with you briefly tonight because I think some of them might be kind of suggestive for you. The first of the 7 pillars is simply values, the stance we took about values and defining values. And the idea here is that many people would say you can't talk about giving voice to values because everyone's values are different. People will usually point to cross-cultural situations, but even beyond that, they'll talk about different political or religious backgrounds or just different families, just different people. And sure, of course there are differences. But what we looked at when we looked at a lot of research was that the finding has been that, although there are differences, that there tend to be a set of core values that have been consistently identified by researchers across time and across culture. So the idea there is that you can't say that we're so different that there's no way to talk to each other. It's a set of values like honesty, integrity, fairness, compassion, the things you would expect. But the other observation, there's 2 observations under the values pillar. One is that there are, in fact, shared values. The other is that it is a really, really short list. And the reason that that is important is that you need to think, when you've decided that you want to voice your values, you want to think about, well, does this situation, how can I frame this situation so that I'm appealing to a value that is most likely to be widely shared? And so that I'm not just talking to myself. I'm not just talking about what matters to me. But I'm actually thinking about, is this something that is relevant for most people? And can I frame it in a way that most people will understand what's truly at stake? So it's important both to understand that it's possible to talk about values with many different people, but that you need to understand and be realistic and have your eyes wide open that it's going to be a short list that's going to be shared. The second pillar is simply choice. And what I mean by that is that when I went to interview people, as I said, I was looking for people who I knew had a good story to tell. But a lot of times when I would come to people and I'd say, will you tell me the story about whatever it was, they'd say, yes, Mary, I'll tell you that story. But before I tell you that story, I want to tell you about a time when I didn't voice my values. And I started thinking, this is interesting. Didn't happen with everyone, but it happened with enough people that I started thinking about it. And I realized that that's a big part of what makes it possible for us to voice and act on our values, is if we think about the idea of choice. And we acknowledge the fact that we have all, and I'm fairly confident in saying this. I haven't had an audience yet that has maybe an individual here and there, but most people have agreed that we have all had times when we have, in fact, faced values conflicts where we found a way to voice and act on our values. And we have all, in fact, also had experiences where we failed to do so. So what's important about that is that we're saying this is not about good people and bad people. It's not about those morally courageous people that I talked about at the beginning of the talk and moral cowards. It's actually about everybody. We all have choices. Now, often when we face moral conflicts, we'll say, I didn't have a choice. But what I found from talking to people is that many people acted in the same kinds of scenarios that other people felt they had no choice. And you tried to figure out what was different. And I think one of the things that's different is if, in fact, you actually have practiced saying some of those words, you've pre-scripted them, you feel that you have arguments, and you feel that these situations are things you've anticipated, which actually leads us to the next one of the pillars. The third pillar is normalization. And what I found when I talked to people is that if you think about ethics conflicts as the kinds of things that you're working along, you have in your life, you're doing your business, and all of a sudden this ethical conflict comes out in front of you, and people have a deer in headlight reaction. It's like, oh gosh, what am I going to do? And I just want to get past this and get back to doing my work. And so a lot of times people will kind of just close their eyes and swallow hard and just do what they were asked to do so they can get back to their real work life, right? This was a distraction. It was something they didn't feel equipped to handle. It was something they didn't want to think about. They didn't have time for it, et cetera, et cetera. I remember having a conversation with the guy, one of the people I was interviewing, who was describing just that phenomenon. And he was a consultant who worked on M&A deals, mergers and acquisitions deals. And he told me that, you know, he worked for the firm that was actually usually arranging the acquisition, but he often would end up working for an extended period over a number of months with the senior management of the firm that was going to be acquired. And he said that, you know, early in his career, he'd had the experience of sitting in an airport with these two guys who had been, you know, senior managers at one of the firms to be acquired. And they turned to him and they said, you know, Joe, can you be straight with us? Now, you know, understand they've been working together for a number of months now, and they developed a kind of working relationship and friendship. So can you be straight with us? You know, do we still have jobs after this? Or are our jobs going to go away? Now, of course, as you know, in these kinds of situations, there are redundancies, and a number of times jobs will disappear. So the guy I was interviewing was saying that, you know, it was like one of those moments. He didn't anticipate it. He didn't want to lie to these people. He considered them friends. He also knew he had an obligation to his employer not to say anything. In his view, the right thing to do would be not to tell them anything he may or may not know, but also he didn't want to lie to them. And so he was just really torn about, what can I say? What can I do? And so he turned to me and he said, Mary, in the moment I lied, he said. And then he paused and then he said, you know, instinctively I lied. And he said, and that kind of struck me. And then he said, but then I went home and I was thinking about it. And it bothered me because I did consider these guys friends. And he said, I realized, you know, I really like my work. I really like working on M&A deals. I want to do this for my career. I'm going to run into this situation all the time. This is going to happen a lot. So I have to figure out who I want to be. Do I want to be someone who just lies every time? Or do I want to figure out if there's another way to do this? And he said, you know, I just wasn't comfortable with this because part of what enabled me to be effective was building a relationship with these people. And how could I build a relationship with these people now that I know that I'm likely to come to this situation every time where I'm going to have to lie to them? And so he said he thought about it, and he said he realized, you know, this isn't such a big deal. It felt like this painful situation, but this is a normal part of doing this kind of business, is to run into these scenarios. So what I need to do is to think about what I can honestly but comfortably say. And so he created a script for himself. And you know, his script had to do with saying, look, even if I know something I couldn't tell you, you know I couldn't tell you because of my fiduciary responsibilities. But let me tell you what I've learned over time working in this kind of situation about what I think you should be thinking about and what I think you should be doing, whether or not you're going to have, whether or not your job is going to be eliminated. And he set up a set of pieces of what he thought were quite valid and actually useful, not just platitude pieces of advice. And he had his script. And when he encountered scenarios like that, again, he used that script. Now you might say, well, that's nothing, not rocket science there. But what was really important there was that he now thinks of himself as someone who can tell the truth, rather than someone who has to lie to do his business. Now that might not be the biggest lie in the world. You might think that that's an important enough lie to really struggle about. But the fact is, it's part of how he sees himself. And so he began to then see himself as someone who could find creative ways to deal with the kinds of conflicts he was going to encounter. So normalization is the third pillar. He was able to do that when he realized this is not so unusual. So the fourth pillar is purpose. What I mean by that is the people who told me stories about how they voiced and acted on their values tended to be people who defined their set of purpose personally and in their careers and in their businesses and in their industries in a broad sense and an explicit sense. So in other words, they didn't define themselves or their success in terms of just the next deal. They defined their success in terms of what kind of enterprise am I building? What kind of reputation am I building? What kind of colleague do I want to be, like the story I just told you. So they defined their purpose more broadly, and they also defined it explicitly. And what I mean by that is that they named it. They said it out loud. One guy I interviewed, when he took a very senior role with a financial service firm, turned to his wife when he was about to take the, when he was offered the job and said, if I take this job, there are likely to be some significant pressures when I'm going to be pushed to make some decisions that are unethical, and I don't want to make them, and I know they're probably going to come up. So at those points, I might actually have to make some choices that hurt us financially. And I don't want to be in that position that you always read about in the case studies where the person is saying, but my family is counting on the income, or whatever it is, it's going to be very hard. I want to tell you going in that this is how I think of these scenarios, and to see if we can agree that if that comes up, I want to be able to walk away if I have to. And he had that conversation in advance. And that enabled him to feel free. But what he was doing was explicitly naming his purpose. And his purpose was broader than their annual income. Now, everybody has a different point about what's a sufficient income, but what he was doing was making it explicit. And it's not just about income. It can be purpose in terms of the impact you want to have on your industry. So the fourth pillar, the people who tended to voice their values effectively tended to name their purpose explicitly and tended to define it more broadly. The fifth pillar is one of my favorites. It's called, we call it self-knowledge and alignment. And what I mean by that is a kind of self-assessment. But usually when people talk about self-assessment when they're in an ethics context, they are talking about values clarification exercises. And these are the exercises that some of you have probably been through, where you go through a set of lists and you narrow down what values are really important to me. And that's okay. But personally, in my experience, observing people using that kind of exercise, people tend to come up with motherhood and apple pie. Pretty much everybody comes up with a short list of similar values. It's my first point about the short list of hypernorms, honesty, integrity, compassion, wisdom, etc. So, there's a value in naming them. There's a value in naming to yourself that's important to you, but it doesn't really seem to help me think about how to act. So, but the kind of self-knowledge and the kind of self-assessment that we engage with in giving voice to values is more about understanding my own strengths in terms of communication and in terms of action, so that I can play to those strengths when I encounter a values conflict. So for example, and this gets back to the title of the talk again today, when I first started doing this work, I had, as a kind of shy person and kind of an introvert myself, I had the assumption that in order to act on your values, you had to be kind of morally courageous. You had to be kind of bold. You had to be kind of willing to stand up and be assertive in the face of these things. And I personally worried about that because although I had values, I didn't see myself as, I was more conflict averse. I didn't see myself as someone who wanted to be in that situation. So, I was a little worried about that. But then I started doing these interviews, and it was interesting because there were some people I interviewed who that certainly was their profile. These were people who would say, I remember there was one guy I interviewed who's a real estate investor, quite successful. I remember him saying, I think of myself as a real risk taker. It's pretty assertive, pretty aggressive kind of guy. And then he started describing the ethical conflict or the values conflict he'd encountered. And he said, so, it wasn't that hard for me to deal with this because I'm used to standing up to people and, being a little in your face and being assertive. And he had to argue with a potential partner on how they were the partner wanted to pull some shady deals with an investment. And he had to stand up to him because he didn't want to do it. So for him, it felt like, this is who I am, There was another woman I interviewed who worked for Goldman Sachs, and she did something that I thought was kind of nervy. She had a friend, actually, who approached her and kind of pressured her to share some proprietary Goldman materials, frameworks, templates with him. And she ended up saying no to him. And the guy said to her, the guy who had known her for years, they'd known each other in business school at Wharton, and the guy said to her, that's the first time I ever saw you say no to a friend, and especially it's the first time you ever said no to me. And so I said to her, well, what enabled you to say no in this situation? And she paused and she said, well, I guess at heart I'm kind of a fearful person. And so it seemed to me that this was the safer way to behave. So this kind of got me thinking as I thought about the other people I'd interviewed and what other people said. And I realized that if you see yourself as a real risk taker and a very assertive and aggressive kind of person, if I preach to you to be more cautious, more conservative, to play it safe with the real estate investing deals, it's not going to appeal to you. But if you actually frame the problem in a way that behaving in accordance with your values allows you to be kind of assertive and risk-taking, and you frame it that way, then it's who you are, and you don't feel like it's such a big deal. But on the other hand, if I preach to someone who sees themselves as cautious, as fearful even, which was the word that this Goldman person used, if I preach to you to have moral courage, you're going to feel like, well, that's great, but that's for heroes, you know? I'm just me. I'm just a person. How am I going to do that? So what we started realizing is that what's important is to understand how you see yourself and where you find your greatest strength and your greatest comfort when you're trying to be persuasive, and then to frame the values conflict you've encountered in a way to play to that strength. So we identified a set of characteristics that seemed salient for these people. One we've already mentioned, you know, the way they define their sense of purpose. But we also found that it was important to think about your communication style. Are you an introvert or an extrovert? Do you like to preach or give little speeches? Do you like to ask questions? Do you see yourself as a teacher or a learner? Are you argumentative or are you conflict averse? Another one is whether you see yourself as your risk profile, whether you're risk averse or whether you enjoy risk taking. And the fourth one was whether you are more comfortable operating autonomously or collaboratively. Now, it's not that any one of the answers to those questions means that you're going to be more likely to voice and act on your values effectively. It simply means that when you encounter these conflicts, you'll want to frame it in a way that plays to your own strengths. So the self-assessment, self-knowledge and alignment, I think is a really key one for a lot of us. Because a lot of us, I think, feel that we can't behave in this way. The sixth pillar is voice. And we've talked about that a little bit already. But it's the idea that, in fact, if you say these things out loud in front of people who stand in as proxy for the people who you're going to have to say them to in the workplace, it's going to be easier to say them later. It becomes muscle memory. It's a default position. I actually had this insight when I was taking a self-defense class when I was still at Harvard. It's interesting that I felt the need to take a self-defense class when I was at Harvard, but I did. And it's the only time in my life I felt the need to do that. And it was a class called model mugging. I don't know if any of you have heard of that technique. But instead of just going to a class where they, teach you the moves, heel to nose or, knee to groin or foot to instep, instead of just teaching you the moves, they actually have some guy who dresses up like the Michelin Man. He's all padded. And he comes in and he literally attacks you full force. And you've, of course, been told what the moves are, but then you get to use them full force. And the idea behind it is that you're using your muscles in a heightened state of adrenaline and that there's a kind of muscle memory that kicks in then. So that if later you are, in fact, attacked and your brain leaves you because of the adrenaline in the situation, that your body already remembers that in that heightened state of adrenaline, these are the things I should do. So it was interesting because I started thinking about that in terms of values conflicts and started thinking about the heightened emotion and energy and anxiety and defensiveness and even fear, sometimes anger, sometimes betrayal, all the things that people feel. And started thinking, well, maybe we need to create opportunities for people to practice those kinds of situations. So this is muscle memory. And so I sort of came up with this by combining the stories I told you about earlier, about moral courage and Columbia, et cetera. It was interesting. After I started developing this, I started working with faculty at other institutions. And there was one, he's now faculty, he was then a doctoral student at William and Mary in Virginia, who said, there's a lot of cognitive neuroscience research that actually supports what you're talking about. And he started telling me about the research on neural pathways and somatic markers and how if you express certain kinds of things in certain kinds of conditions, you're actually making it easier that you can do that again. So for me, that was interesting. It felt like there were a number of different traditions and a number of different research approaches that were supporting this same idea. So that's what voice is about, that this is not just a cognitive experience, although it is very much that. It's also an experiential and behavioral experience, that you have to have the chance to practice this. The seventh pillar is what we call reasons and rationalizations. And what I mean by that is that in the course of interviewing all these people and looking at all these scenarios and reading all these student papers, we realized that the kinds of arguments that people encounter when they face values conflicts are fairly predictable and fairly limited and vulnerable to response if we've thought about them in advance. And we started to identify the most commonly heard reasons of rationalizations for saying that you could not act on your values. And then we started to think about how people might respond to those, and we started to generate those responses. We also looked at a lot of the latest research in social psychology that's talking about how people frame situations, how people use decision-making biases and tools and heuristics to make decisions. And we thought maybe we can use some of those to help us make better responses. So for example, if we know that people tend to underweight long-term costs and overweight short-term costs or benefits, then maybe what we need to do is create arguments that help make the long-term benefits more tangible to people so it feels more immediate. So we started, and there's a lot of those. There's a lot of these kinds of decision-making tools. People will tend to be vulnerable to false consensus. They'll assume that everybody agrees with them. Or they'll be vulnerable to, well, I mentioned the one about short-term and long-term, but there's a lot of ways in which people will, they'll think in terms of the, what do they call it? The slippery slope kind of argument, and that they won't, and as I said earlier, they won't make concrete the costs to not doing the thing that they think is right, but they will make concrete the costs of doing the thing that they think is right. So we started to name these, and we actually have them all written down, and we actually have examples of people's responses. The idea being that if you start practicing this, after a while, it's pretty predictable. Some of them are actually even make it easy for you. Like a lot of times people will say the reason that they can't act ethically in a situation is because there's no time. So what we learned from talking to people who had faced that one is that they said, Mary, I mean, it's so simple. It's not rocket science, but I just hadn't thought about it. Well, if they're saying that, that means that they're already acknowledging that it's wrong. So half your argument is done. So then what it becomes is simply an implementation challenge. Is there some way to do this quickly? And then you apply an entirely different set of skills, and you trigger an entirely different set of feelings around the issue. So the last pillar is reasons and rationalizations, and what that means is that we've identified the most frequently heard reasons and rationalizations for not voicing your values, and we've started to identify some of the responses that we've heard that work. I'm going to wind down now because we're running out of time, but I simply want to say that with all of these tools and all of these stories, we're not saying that these always work. We're not saying that the same ones will always work in every situation. As I said earlier, you have to understand yourself and your own strengths. Similarly, you need to understand the person that you're speaking to or the people that you're speaking to. We've also learned that voice has to be viewed as a metaphor, that in some cultures, it's not about my having a conversation with you. It's actually about working as, maybe I have to build a coalition. Maybe I have to work through someone else to get to you. But what we've learned is that there are tools that do work, that they are definitely learnable tools, and that it's less about being a good person than it is about viewing this as an implementation challenge. And that becomes something that it is appropriate to think and teach about in a business school, because that's what business schools are about, right? It's a place to learn to behave and manage effectively. If you're going to pursue a particular business challenge, you don't know that it's going to be successful, but you do the analysis and you give it your best shot, and you actually are able to anticipate a lot of the kinds of conflicts and a lot of the kinds of risks that you'll face so that you can prepare for them. We're suggesting, why don't we do the same thing with values conflicts? Why don't we stop spending all our time debating what is right and just say, when you know what's right, let's do some practice here. I'm going to conclude by telling you about something that I think really helps for me in terms of thinking about this curriculum. I read an article a number of years ago, back when I was still at HBS, and it was written by Greg Dees and Peter Crampton on ethics and negotiation. And in that article, they talked about a model that they hadn't developed, but they used it effectively. And they said, if you think about business people as a bell curve distribution, and if you think about it, one tail end, we'll call people idealists. And these are people who say that they would voice and act on their values no matter what the cost to themselves materially. And then at the other small tail, there's what we'll call opportunists. And these are people who say, I will act in what I believe to be my material self-interest no matter what the value is at stake. That most people, and this is an assumption that Greg Dees and Peter Crampton made, it's also an assumption that I make and that I tend to think is pretty realistic in business schools, that most people in business would probably see themselves as pragmatists. And the way they define pragmatists is people who would like to act on their values as long as they felt that they were not at a systematic disadvantage. Now, what I mean by that is not that as long as they felt that they wouldn't pay a price. It's rather that they actually think that there is a chance of being effective. You don't engage in a new business deal if you think there is no chance of being successful. But similarly, if you're a pragmatist around values issues, you would like to act in accordance with your values. You don't set out to violate your values, but you want to feel that you're not at a systematic disadvantage when you try to do that. So to some people, when I express that, they find that kind of cynical and kind of depressing. But I actually find it profoundly hopeful, because to me then it says the challenge is one of skill. The challenge is one of competence, and the challenge is one of confidence. And that if we practice this, and we develop multiple scripts, and we have a chance to peer coach with each other and make those scripts better, we're going to feel more confident and more competent at doing this. So my agenda is not to try and make people better than who they are. My agenda is to frankly try and develop a curriculum that enables people to have the skills to be as good as they are. So there may be some folks who consider themselves opportunists. I'm not really trying to change them. I feel like if we can help the folks who are in that pragmatist category to feel that they actually have a shot at behaving in the way they have already acknowledged they want to behave, then that's enough. So that's kind of where I will end this today, and that's kind of what I meant by moral courage and moral competence. I really appreciate your listening, and I'd be happy to respond to any questions that we have time for. Thank you.
It was great hearing how you guys designed the curriculum, but the question that I had was, how did you guys make sure, or what measures have you guys taken to make sure that what you guys, well, I mean, the group of people who actually design the curriculum, and the group of people who actually deliver it's the students are different. How did you guys, what measures did you guys take that, what measures did you guys take to make sure that the delivery happened to the students?
The quality of the delivery, is that what you're talking about? So I don't know if everyone could hear. I think he was saying that, and tell me if I'm getting this right, sir, but he was kind of saying, you know, it's great that we developed this curriculum, but what kinds of precautions or steps did we take to make sure that when other people implement the curriculum that they're doing it effectively and that there is some sort of quality control? That's actually a great question, and it's something I struggle with. I think in the short term it's been easier because it was something that's grown quite organically. And so as people hear about this, they've been contacting me directly. I mean, we have all the materials available for free on the website to educators, and any educators who want to use them all over the world can just download them. But we also have information, and we have teaching notes, which is a big part of trying to instill the quality control, because the cases and the exercises anyone can download, students and business people and faculty. But the teaching notes, which actually give the kinds of advice that I was sort of talking a little bit about tonight, about how to think about sharing this with people, That's only available to faculty. It's still free, but you have to be vetted by me or one of our staff to make sure that you're faculty. So that's one piece of the quality control, is that we've developed teaching notes to go with it. But the other piece is that what has been happening is that people then contact me directly. And usually they want to talk about how do we customize this for our institution, what are the best materials to use in our circumstances, could we partner with you to develop new materials. One thing I didn't mention was that as we've taken this global, we've found faculty in other parts of the world who want to develop giving voice to values style cases and scripting exercises based in their culture. So I have a number of faculty in India now who are developing India GVV cases. I'm working with some faculty in China who are developing China GVV cases. I've got some folks in South America who are using this material. We've got folks in other parts of the US who are developing more cases and materials. So as people do that, that also becomes, they interact with me because I review everything they develop, and we have to approve it before we make it available. The other thing that started to happen is that some faculty who have been early adopters have said, well, I want to see if I'm doing this effectively, and I want to see if this is actually an effective approach. So now there are a few institutions that the faculty are actually engaged in some research. I'm working with a professor at Yale right now who's doing an empirical study to look at whether this approach of pre-scripting actually enables people to be more creative, to have more ideas, to feel that it's more possible to act on their values. But I'm also working with some faculty at some other institutions who are simply doing pre and post surveys of their students, where they kind of survey them before and after and give them some questions and scenarios to see if they have a greater repertoire of things that they could imagine doing when they encounter these kinds of values conflicts. So those are all some of the ways that we're doing this. But you've put your finger on an important issue, which is as this approach grows, and it is growing, I'm not going to be able to have that high-touch kind of approach. So one of the things that I'm talking to folks at Babson about, and I'm talking to a network in India about, is developing, and I'm talking to some folks in China about, is developing opportunities to do faculty development programs in other parts of the world, where faculty who want to teach this can come together. I can talk to them, but more importantly, they can talk to each other and hear how it's been going in their institutions. I just got an email yesterday from a guy in Mumbai who's been using these materials, and he loves using the materials, but he was sharing with me the students' responses to all of them, and it was really interesting because, not surprisingly, the students' favorites and the ones that they felt were most realistic were the India-based GVV cases. Now, it's not that the others aren't realistic, but they're not relevant to them. And so that's one of the pieces in terms of quality control that I'd like to do more of, too. So, thank you. Other questions, thoughts, ideas? Yep.
As you've taken this globally, have you found any significant differences when trying to identify core values across cultures?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one of the questions I get most often. And the answer is I haven't found differences in terms of the core values, but I have found differences in terms of the method of expressing them and the barriers or challenges that you're going to face in doing so. So, for example, when I said earlier that voice, when we went to China and we went to Southeast Asia, that's when I learned that we needed to become explicit that the word voice in giving voice to values is a metaphor. That we're not necessarily saying that you stand up and give an impassioned little speech to your boss. In fact, that doesn't work very well anywhere in terms of my experience. But that in fact it's a metaphor for finding a way to express your values. And that quite often, especially in some other cultures, we've found that it's less about that kind of confrontation, and it's more about building a case, asking questions, doing research, building a coalition. So we've had to be explicit about that. So we've learned that there's some challenges in implementation, and also there's some different challenges in terms of the kinds of conflicts you face. I told Michael earlier today that one of the most poignant stories when I took this to China was that China, I hadn't known this before I went there, but apparently the central government in China decrees or decides what the MBA curriculum should include. And they had recently decided that business ethics needed to be a required part of all MBA curricula. And so they put together a two-day program in Shanghai at Jiaotong University, or School of Economics, to bring together business ethics faculty from around China. They had about 100 faculty. They thought they were going to have like 30. They had like 100 faculty. And they spent the 2 days presenting their different approaches and what they were doing. They also had the economist from Beijing that the central government had appointed as kind of the business ethics czar to sort of share his vision. And then they asked me to keynote about giving voice to values. And I was thinking, holy moly, you know, I don't know if this is going to go over here. You know, I hadn't done any work in China yet. But it was fascinating. It went over extremely well. People were really receptive, so receptive that they asked if I would stick around after the workshop. And about 30 of them stayed for another couple hours just to talk about how to do this. But the most poignant thing, which gets to your question, is that after 2 hours of talking, one of the final comments was a gentleman who said, you know, Mary, I really like this approach, and I really want to try it in my teaching. He was from Beijing. But he said, the challenge I face, though, is that what do you do when the institution or the individual that you're trying to, your target audience, is not your boss, is not your company, is not your customer, but it's the central government? You know? And I thought, well, this is interesting, you know, because it's clearly the same kind of challenge, but it's writ large, you know. And I certainly didn't have an answer to that. I mean, I had not been generating stories in that kind of context. But that was how I responded, was I invited him, you know, let's work together and generate these stories. Because one of the things I've learned from doing this work, and I told Michael this too, I kind of got into this after I had been working in business ethics for a number of decades, and actually for about 15 years, and I took a break from it because I lost faith. I had a kind of crisis of faith. And I started to feel that maybe it wasn't ethical to teach about business ethics, because if you're teaching people that they need to think about these issues and then it's not possible to act on them, is that ethical? It's kind of an exercise in hypocrisy. And it wasn't until I started having that experience that I described to you at the beginning of this talk at Columbia that I started realizing, no, you know, people do this. People find ways to do this. And it's not just the CEO heroes that we used to, you know, write cases about at HBS that I always felt a little uncomfortable about because they weren't heroes. You know, some of them did heroic things, but they also did not so great things, just like all of us. And when I started having this idea that, no, it's not about that, it's about individual decisions all along the way, it started to make me feel more confident and more comfortable with doing this kind of work. And I think that's part of what makes it more appealing when I go overseas as well, because there's a high sensitivity, especially when I go to some developing countries, to the idea that people in the West, i.e. I'm from the US, that we will view their culture as unethical and corrupt. And so when they start to understand that where I'm coming from is not about good people, good cultures, bad cultures, but about a series of decisions that we all make that we can get better at making, then it actually opens up a dialogue. And I have students who regularly then will come to me after the talks, you know, and say, you know, I'm from Nigeria. Everyone thinks it's all about corruption there, and there is a lot of corruption there, but actually we're now doing some things. Or I'm from India, and I used to think that, you know, I couldn't behave ethically in business, but I'd like to think I could. Or I'm from, you know, and you can fill in your country. And I usually say, you know, I'm from Boston, and, you know, we have some problems too. You know, so I just have found that it's a way of framing that allows people to feel that more is possible. So. Any other comments? Yep.
Yeah, I was wondering, has this style of thinking, like, kind of been disseminated in any other fields besides business, like education or medical or anything?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I certainly set out just to do something with MBA education, because that's what I knew best. And then the first thing that happened is I started getting requests to do this in executive business education or undergraduate business education. And now I've started to get requests from businesses. But I'm starting to get some requests from other institutions. I've gotten a couple calls from engineering schools, and I'm doing a session in about a week in Austin for the School of Liberal Arts there. So I'm starting to get that kind of approach. In fact, the wife of my editor, I have a book coming out on this from Yale Press in August, and the wife of my editor is a psychologist, and she works with schools, college and high school students around substance abuse issues. And she thinks it would be an interesting approach for creating scenarios for kids to practice how to handle those kinds of scenarios where you're being pressured and you're trying to figure out what you can say in those moments. It's similarly just something that if you create some scripts and practice them, it's not rocket science. So the answer is yes, and I'm hoping that that will grow even more. Yeah. Any other questions, thoughts, comments, suggestions? Well, I thank you very much. You've been a great audience.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
I know many of you do have to get to class, but she's also willing to hang around a little while just informally if you like. So thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Sure. It was a fun group.